When I moved to Havendale, I thought I'd found a slice of suburban paradise, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and a perfect home. But what started as a simple plan to build a fence turned into a fiery battle with an overzealous HOA president. Little did I know that fence would challenge more than just property lines. It would shake the entire community. When I first set foot in the neighborhood of Havendale, it felt like I'd walked into the pages of a picture-perfect suburban dream. The streets were lined with immaculate lawns, kids rode their bikes without a care, and neighbors waved politely as they passed. It was everything I had envisioned for a fresh start, a quiet place where I could finally breathe. The house itself was charming, with its white shutters and cozy front porch, but what truly sold me was the backyard. It was expansive, with old oaks casting long shadows, perfect for evenings under the stars. Yet, as much as I loved the space, there was a problem I couldn't ignore: the lack of a boundary. The yard felt open, exposed, and oddly vulnerable, like anyone could wander in at any time. I wasn't paranoid, but the idea of prying eyes or unexpected visitors didn't sit well with me. Privacy mattered to me, and the absence of it was like a nagging itch I couldn't scratch. The solution seemed simple: a fence. Nothing flashy or over the top, just something to define the space and create a sanctuary for myself. But in a neighborhood as orderly as Havendale, I knew better than to act impulsively. I wanted everything above board. So I spent weeks researching. I visited City Hall to pull zoning permits, consulted local ordinances, and even hired a surveyor to confirm my property lines. Every step reassured me I was in the clear. When I finally held the approved plans in my hands, a wave of satisfaction swept over me. I could almost see it: a sturdy wooden fence running along the edges of my yard, a quiet statement of ownership and peace. It was a small change, but to me, it represented a long overdue step toward making this house feel like home. What I didn't know was that this seemingly straightforward decision was about to ignite a storm I couldn't have anticipated. The fence project began on a crisp Tuesday morning. I remember stepping outside with my coffee, breathing in the cool air as the construction crew unloaded their equipment. They worked efficiently, marking the boundary lines and placing the first posts. Watching those wooden stakes go into the ground filled me with a sense of accomplishment. After weeks of planning and preparation, my vision was finally taking shape. I was admiring their progress when I noticed a figure walking toward my property. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a neatly pressed blazer that seemed out of place in our laid-back neighborhood. His gait was deliberate, each step exuding authority. I recognized him immediately. It was Ronald Hutchins, the president of our homeowners association. I'd seen his name stamped on newsletters and occasionally heard neighbors mention his strict enforcement of HOA rules. This, however, was the first time we were meeting face to face. "Good morning," I greeted him as he reached the edge of my yard. I tried to keep my tone polite, though his expression was anything but welcoming. He stopped, arms crossed, and stared at the wooden posts like they were an affront to his very existence. "Morning," he replied curtly, barely glancing at me. "What's going on here?" "It's a fence," I said, gesturing toward the construction crew. "I've been planning this for a while, got all the permits, had the property lines surveyed. Everything's in order." Ronald didn't smile. Instead, his eyebrows knitted together in a way that made it clear he wasn't here to congratulate me. "Permits from the city, I assume?" he asked, his tone as sharp as a blade. "That's right," I confirmed. "Everything's above board." He sighed, shaking his head. "The city's permits don't mean much here, Mr. Rivers. This is HOA territory, and we have our own set of rules. Did you submit your plans to the board for approval?" I blinked, caught off guard. I wasn't aware I needed HOA approval for something on my own property. The fence doesn't encroach on any easements or community land. "That's not the point," he snapped. "We have guidelines in place to maintain the aesthetic harmony of this neighborhood. All exterior modifications require board review and approval, fences included." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. I understand wanting to keep the neighborhood looking nice, but this is a simple wooden fence. It's not an eyesore or anything flashy. I've seen other homes around here with fences. Ronald's lips thinned into a straight line. "Those were approved," he said tersely. "If you proceed without board consent, you'll be in violation of HOA regulations. I strongly advise you to halt construction until this matter is resolved." It took everything in me not to argue further. "I'll review the HOA guidelines," I said, keeping my voice even. "But as far as I know, I'm within my rights to build this." "Do that," he replied, his eyes narrowing. But if this continues without approval, there will be consequences. With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving me standing in the yard with a sinking feeling in my stomach. That evening, I dug out the thick HOA handbook I'd received when I bought the house. I spent hours combing through its densely packed pages, looking for anything about fences. The guidelines were vague at best. They mentioned maintaining a harmonious aesthetic, but didn't explicitly forbid fences like mine. Nor was there any clear requirement to seek board approval for modifications to private property. Relieved, I decided to move forward with construction. I wasn't about to let someone bully me into compliance with unwritten rules. 2 days later, I returned home from work to find an orange notice taped to my front door. The words "violation notice" were printed in bold, angry letters. My stomach turned as I read the details. The HOA claimed my fence was an unapproved modification and gave me 72 hours to cease construction and remove the posts. Failure to comply, the notice warned, would result in daily fines and potential legal action. Frustration bubbled inside me as I grabbed my phone and dialed the number listed on the notice. Unsurprisingly, Ronald answered on the first ring. "Mr. Rivers," he said, his tone as cold as ever. "I see you've received the violation notice." "I have," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "And I've reviewed the HOA rules. There's nothing in them that prohibits my fence or requires me to seek prior approval." "As I told you before," Ronald said sharply, "all modifications must be reviewed by the board. That is non-negotiable." "This is unreasonable," I countered. "I've followed every legal step, and the fence is on my property. You can't enforce a rule that doesn't exist." Ronald let out a sigh, the kind you'd use with a stubborn child. "The HOA exists to maintain order, Mr. Rivers. If everyone started building whatever they wanted, this neighborhood would fall into chaos. Think about the bigger picture." "And I need you to think about the law," I shot back. "I'm not removing the fence. If you want to take this further, I suggest you consult a lawyer." The line went silent for a moment before Ronald replied, his voice icy. "You'll regret this." He hung up, leaving me furious but resolute. I wasn't about to back down. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would shake the very foundation of Havendale. The orange notice on my door was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Ronald ramped up his efforts to intimidate me into compliance. More notices appeared, each more threatening than the last. One warned of steep fines, $200 a day, if I didn't dismantle the fence. Another claimed the HOA was preparing to file a formal lawsuit against me. Despite the barrage of threats, I held firm. The fence was nearing completion, and I wasn't about to let Ronald scare me into submission. I knew the law was on my side, but that didn't make the situation any less exhausting. Each notice felt like a punch in the gut, a constant reminder that Ronald wasn't just enforcing rules, he was waging a personal vendetta. I began documenting everything, photos of the notices, emails, and even a recording of my tense phone calls with Ronald. If this was going to escalate, I wanted to be prepared. It was late one evening when the conflict took a shocking turn. I was on the couch, half watching a nature documentary, when a strange scraping noise jolted me upright. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling something outside, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. I grabbed my phone and moved toward the sliding glass door leading to the backyard. Pulling back the curtain, I froze. There, under the dim glow of the porch light, was Ronald Hutchins. He was hunched over one of the fence posts, a crowbar in his hands, and his face set in grim determination. My heart pounded as I realized what he was doing. He was trying to tear down my fence. I threw open the door, my voice cutting through the still night air. "Ronald, what the hell are you doing?" Startled, he dropped the crowbar with a metallic clang. For a moment, he looked guilty, but his expression quickly hardened into defiance. "This fence violates HOA regulations," he said, straightening up. "I'm enforcing the rules." "On my property?" I demanded, stepping closer. "You're trespassing. Get off my land before I call the police." Ronald didn't flinch. "This fence blocks access to a communal pathway," he snapped, pointing to the narrow strip of grass along the property line. "It's my duty to protect the community." "That's not a communal pathway," I said, my voice rising. "It's part of my property, and you know it. I have the survey to prove it." Ignoring me, Ronald bent to pick up the crowbar again. "If you won't take it down, I will. You've left me no choice." I didn't wait to argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser attempting to destroy my property," I told the dispatcher, keeping my eyes locked on Ronald. "He's still here, and he has a tool in hand." Hearing the call, Ronald straightened, his face dark with anger. "Fine," he muttered, tossing the crowbar to the ground. "Let's see what the police have to say." The minutes stretched on like hours as we stood there, glaring at each other under the night sky. When the patrol car finally pulled up, relief washed over me. 2 officers stepped out, their calm presence a welcome contrast to Ronald's bluster. I explained the situation to one of them, showing him my permits and the survey documents I'd kept on hand. Ronald, of course, wasted no time launching into his defense, insisting that the fence violated HOA guidelines and blocked community access. The officer listened patiently before addressing him. "Mr. Hutchins, this survey clearly shows the fence is on Mr. Rivers' property. Furthermore, he has all the necessary permits. Your presence here, attempting to dismantle his fence, is trespassing." Ronald's face flushed crimson. "But it violates the HOA guidelines. Don't override property law," the officer interrupted firmly. "If you have an issue, you need to address it through legal channels, not by taking matters into your own hands." With no room left to argue, Ronald stormed off, muttering under his breath. As the patrol car drove away, I stood in the quiet of my backyard, the adrenaline still coursing through me. I'd won this round, but deep down, I knew this fight wasn't over. Ronald wasn't the kind of man to back down so easily. The morning after Ronald's late-night stunt, I sat at my kitchen table, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, staring at the police report detailing the incident. It was surreal. How had a simple fence turned into this? I forwarded the report to my lawyer, Sarah Grayson, a sharp and tenacious attorney I'd hired after Ronald's threats started escalating. She called me within minutes. "This is serious, Michael," Sarah said. "He didn't just cross a line, he obliterated it. Trespassing and attempting to destroy your property. That's not just an HOA issue. That's criminal." I could hear the determination in her voice, and it gave me a sense of relief. "What's our next step?" I asked. "We're filing a lawsuit," she said, without hesitation. "Compensation for property damage, emotional distress, and an injunction to prevent him from coming near your property again. If Ronald wants a fight, he'll get one, but it's going to be in a courtroom." A week later, we filed the suit. The process was daunting, but Sarah guided me through every step. We compiled an airtight case: the survey documents, building permits, photos of the fence, the violation notices, and most damning, the police report. Sarah also included statements from neighbors who had witnessed Ronald's aggressive behavior at HOA meetings. Each piece of evidence painted a clear picture of a man drunk on power, willing to break the law to assert his control. The court date came faster than I expected. Walking into the courthouse that morning, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. Ronald was already there, flanked by a lawyer who looked as rigid as he did. He shot me a cold glare as I passed, but I refused to engage. In the courtroom, Sarah was a force of nature. She presented our case with precision, methodically dismantling every argument Ronald's attorney tried to make. When Ronald claimed he was acting in the HOA's interest, Sarah countered with the HOA's own vague guidelines, showing there was no specific rule prohibiting the fence. When he insisted the fence blocked a communal pathway, she presented the survey map proving otherwise. "Mr. Hutchins," Sarah said during cross-examination, her tone sharp yet composed, "do you often find it necessary to enforce HOA rules by breaking the law, trespassing on private property, and attempting to dismantle someone else's construction without their consent?" Ronald fidgeted under her gaze. "I was protecting community interests," he said weakly. "The law protects private property," Sarah shot back. "And as this court can see, your actions had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with personal vendetta." The judge didn't need much time to deliberate. The verdict was in my favor. Ronald was ordered to pay compensation for emotional distress and legal fees, as well as a hefty fine for his unlawful actions. The court also issued a restraining order, barring him from coming within 100 feet of my property. As we walked out of the courthouse, Sarah turned to me with a triumphant smile. "That man's reign of terror just took a serious hit." I nodded, feeling the weight of the fight lifting off my shoulders. But I also knew Ronald wouldn't take this defeat quietly. The battle might be over, but the war wasn't finished. Not yet. The court ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. News of Ronald's loss spread quickly, and it didn't take long for whispers to turn into open discussions. At first, I noticed small signs, neighbors nodding in support as I walked by, a few stopping me to say how brave I was to stand up to him. But then came the bigger shift. People started questioning Ronald's leadership outright. It began with an email from the HOA board itself. The subject line read, "Community meeting, leadership review, and policy discussion." The message was clear. There would be a vote to review Ronald's position as president and evaluate HOA policies. For the first time since moving here, I felt the tide turning in my favor. As the meeting approached, Ronald launched a desperate campaign to cling to power. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, warning of the chaos that would supposedly follow his removal. In them, he painted himself as the neighborhood's savior, claiming his strict enforcement was the only thing standing between us and falling property values. It was laughable, but also desperate. Several neighbors confided in me that he had even gone door to door, trying to sway their votes. In response, I worked with Sarah and a small group of supportive neighbors to distribute our own letters. Unlike Ronald's fear-mongering, ours were factual. We detailed his abuses of power, included excerpts from the court ruling, and highlighted the costs his actions had already incurred for the community. My favorite part was including a copy of the survey map that had so thoroughly debunked his communal pathway claim. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. The usual calm atmosphere was replaced with buzzing anticipation. Ronald sat at the front, his expression tense, flanked by the remaining board members. When the meeting began, he launched into his typical rhetoric about preserving community standards. But the room didn't respond the way he hoped. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, looked around at the crowd, and said, "This isn't about fences. This is about fairness, transparency, and respect. Leadership shouldn't come from threats or intimidation. We deserve better than that." The applause was thunderous, and even some of Ronald's usual supporters looked shaken. When the vote was finally tallied, the results were clear. Ronald Hutchins was removed from his position by an overwhelming majority. For the first time, the community had spoken against his reign of control, and their voices carried more weight than all his rules combined. The days following Ronald's removal felt like a breath of fresh air sweeping through Havendale. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for so long was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community. Under the interim leadership of Miss Whitaker, the board began implementing policies that emphasized transparency and fairness. Decisions were discussed openly, and for the first time, residents felt like their voices mattered. My fence, the catalyst for all this upheaval, still stood proudly in my backyard, a quiet testament to perseverance. On sunny afternoons, I would sit on the patio, enjoying the privacy it provided, finally feeling at peace in my own home. The once hostile glances from a few neighbors had been replaced with friendly waves and nods of acknowledgement. It was as though the neighborhood had collectively realized the value of standing together rather than living under one person's oppressive rules. One afternoon, Greg Thompson, a longtime resident, stopped by as I was trimming the bushes near the fence. "You know," he said with a grin, "this fence did more than just give you some privacy. It reminded all of us that we don't have to live under someone else's thumb." I chuckled, leaning on the shears. It wasn't the fight I wanted, but I'm glad it brought about some change. Greg nodded. "You stood your ground, and it paid off. That's something worth being proud of." As he walked away, I looked at the fence once more, its smooth wooden planks glowing softly in the afternoon sun. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a symbol of something bigger: fairness, resilience, and the strength of a community that chose unity over fear. And for me, it was a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, especially when the stakes are as personal as your peace of mind.